She handed coffee to the man with the dog right in front of the inspector. Her boss didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry, just cold final, "You're done here, Grace." 6 years of loyalty erased in a single sentence. She didn't cry, just untied her apron, hand shaking, and walked out. Not because she broke a rule, but because she stood up for a veteran and his service dog. What Grace didn't know was that someone filmed the whole thing. And before the cafe's morning rush was over, the ground began to shake. 4 military Humvees rolled into the lot. Out stepped a Marine colonel in full dress blues, a man who once owed his life to the very veterans she protected. And in that moment, everything changed. Grace Donnelly wasn't the type of woman people noticed first, but she was the one they remembered longest. At 35, she managed the Mason Muga Café tucked on the edge of downtown Mason, Georgia, just a 15-minute drive from Fort Gringanger, one of the largest Marine installations in the Southeast. The town itself was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Oak-lined sidewalks, American flags on every third porch, and a hardware store that hadn't changed its paint color since the Reagan administration. But inside the cafe, things felt different, warmer, more human. Grace made sure of that. She didn't run the cafe like a business. She ran it like a second home, the kind of place where someone could walk in after a long day or a long deployment and feel human again. The coffee wasn't anything fancy, no espresso martinis or complicated froth art, just strong brews, hot refills, and handwritten notes stuck to the bulletin board behind the counter. But what set the Mason mug apart wasn't the coffee. It was Grace. She remembered names, birthdays, blackout dates for deployment. She knew who liked their eggs over hard and who hadn't touched coffee since they got back from Iraq. She made space for silence, especially the kind that came from veterans who carried more than just physical scars. And every Wednesday at 9 a.m. sharp, she hosted what had quietly become a town tradition, Heroes Hour. It started with just 3 of them. Her father-in-law, Ben Donnelly, a retired Marine Corps drill instructor, Ralph, a Vietnam vet who rarely spoke but never missed a week, and Louisa, a former Army nurse with a laugh that echoed like wind chimes over time. The circle grew. Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan veterans from every era found their way to her cafe, drawn less by the menu and more by the woman who ran it. Grace would always say the same thing before starting: "This is a place to be seen, not fixed to sit, not perform." And they'd nod shoulders, easing as they sipped coffee and swapped stories, some funny, some heavy, and some too painful to tell with words. She never spoke much about her own story, but everyone in town knew the outline. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, was killed in action 6 years earlier in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. His photograph hung on the wall above the register, not in uniform, but in jeans and a flannel, holding a mug of coffee outside the cafe's front door. It was taken 2 weeks before his final deployment. He never came home. Grace never remarried, never even hinted at it. She'd poured her grief into the cafe, not to escape it, but to build something out of it, something that mattered. People loved her for it. But more than that, they respected her. Veterans called her ma'am, without irony. Teens held the door for her without being told. Even the mayor stopped by once a month just to thank her for holding the town together better than most institutions. But for Grace, it was never about recognition. It was about the mission, the quiet one, the one that didn't come with medals, but mattered just as much every time she poured a cup of coffee for a vet. Too anxious to sit in a crowded room, every time she walked out from behind the counter to check if someone was okay after staring too long out the window, every time she let a dog curl up under a table without asking questions. It wasn't a rule book she followed. It was instinct. It was love. And that Wednesday morning, the one where everything changed, started like all the others. The bell over the door jingled softly. The regulars filed in. Coffee brewed the cafe, filled with quiet chatter, laughter, and the warm hum of belonging. Grace didn't know it yet. But by the end of the day, that little corner cafe would become the center of a storm that would echo all the way to Washington, and it would all begin with a man, a dog, and a woman who refused to back down. It was a crisp Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where sunlight looked cooler than it felt, and steam rose gently from every cup like little ghosts. Grace was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, greeting every familiar face with that same nod, quiet but warm. She had already brewed the first pot of dark roast for Heroes Hour, and was setting out the stack of ceramic mugs she saved just for the veterans. Then the door opened again, and Ray McMillan stepped in. With Shadow by his side, Ray was one of the newer faces, late 50s, ex-Marine Corps recon. He didn't talk much, and he never stayed long. But he came. That meant something. Shadow, His black lab German Shepherd mix was never more than a few inches from his heel. The dog wore a bright red vest with bold white lettering, "Service dog, do not pet." Grace gave Ray a little wave table by the windows open, she said. Smiling, he nodded, murmured a thanks, and guided Shadow to the far corner. Then the air shifted. The front door swung open with a brisk whoosh, and in walked a man in a navy blazer, neatly pressed slacks, and an expression that seemed allergic to joy. He carried a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. His name tag read, Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace hadn't been expecting a visit. She greeted him politely. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "An inspection," he said flatly. Unannounced, he moved through the space with surgical detachment, tapping on metal surfaces, checking labels, pulling open refrigerator doors, and then he saw the dog. He stopped mid-step like he'd walked into a wall. "That animal," he said loudly, pointing toward Shadow, "is in violation of state health code. No animals permitted where food is served." Heads turned. Conversations went quiet. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, careful not to raise her voice. "He's a registered service dog," she said calmly. "Aiden law permits his presence here." Prescott frowned, scanning the room like he was looking for backup. "I don't care what vest he's wearing," he snapped. "Animals carry dander, saliva, hair. This is a food hazard. Unless you want this cafe shut down, that dog goes." Ray stiffened in his chair, his hand gripping the coffee cup like it might fall. Shadow didn't move. He simply looked up at Ray and waited. The room fell into silence. Grace took a slow breath and said the words she knew she couldn't take back. "I won't ask a veteran to leave, and I won't ask his service dog to leave either. You're welcome to write your report, but you'll do it, knowing you tried to humiliate a man who served this country in front of the very people he served to protect." Prescott's jaw clenched. From across the cafe, someone muttered, "Damn right." But it didn't matter, because standing in the doorway now was another figure, Deborah Lyle, regional manager for the Mason Muggs parent company. Apparently she'd arrived early for a routine check-in, just in time to see it all. Her eyes were wide, her tone was ice. "Grace Donnelly," she said, "you've just violated a direct health compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things, you're terminated." Gasps rang out. A spoon clattered to the floor. Rye stood halfway shocked. Grace didn't move. Not at first. Then she looked around the cafe. She looked at Ray, at Shadow, at the small chalkboard on the wall that said, "Heroes Hour today, free coffee for vets." And she smiled just barely. She untied her apron with trembling fingers, folded it, and placed it on the counter. Then she turned to Elena, the young barista by the espresso machine, and whispered, "Make sure Rye gets his refill." She walked out the side door into the morning sunlight as the cafe stood frozen behind her. No one followed, but someone pressed record, and somewhere out in the ether of phones and social media and invisible networks, a story had just been captured. A quiet act of defiance. A line drawn, a woman fired not because she broke a rule, but because she refused to break her soul. And far away, in an office filled with military photos and brass nameplates, Colonel Richard Gaines got a phone call he wouldn't ignore for 35 minutes. The Mason Mug was silent. Customers whispered, some left their coffee half drunk. Others sat still, glancing out the window like the wind itself might carry in an explanation. But Lena, the young barista Grace had trained, stayed at her post. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured Ray's second cup. "I didn't know what to say," she would later admit. "But I knew if I left that station, I'd be letting her down." Ray sat quietly at his table. He hadn't touched his cup since Grace left. Shadow lay curled at his feet, ears twitching, but still as if he sensed that something had broken in the room. And then it began, a low rumble, barely audible at first, like distant thunder rolling across Georgia hills. Chairs wobbled. Coffee rippled. The cafe's windows began to hum. Customers stood and looked out from the east end of Main Street. Through the morning mist and maple-lined sidewalks came 4 military Humvees, tires growling against pavement. Their lights cut through the haze like search beams. The vehicles pulled into the lot in a slow, deliberate line. Blocking the cafe's front doors opened in unison, and out stepped Colonel Richard Gaines, decorated, composed in full Marine Corps dress, blues, gold buttons, polished white gloves in hand, his ribbons numerous, his expression impenetrable behind him. 24 Marines followed in formation, their uniforms sharp, their presence unmistakable. They stood at attention on the sidewalk outside the cafe. Inside, no one moved. The inspector, Logan Prescott, stood frozen near the pastry case, his clipboard lowered. Forgotten Deborah Lyle, the regional manager, had padded 2 shades and stepped back from the counter like it might burn her. The cafe's bell jingled once, and Colonel Gaines entered alone. His boots struck the floor hard, slow echoing like a drum roll through the silence. He stopped in the center of the cafe, glancing once at Lena, who swallowed hard, then at Ray, who had slowly stood up. Their eyes met. Rai nodded quietly. The colonel returned it with something even deeper, a salute. And that's when Prescott stammered, I didn't know he was the colonel," didn't raise his voice. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic dignity." He turned to Lena. "Is Grace Donnelly here?" Lena shook her head. She was fired for standing up for Mr. McMillan, and Shadow Colonel Gaines turned his jaw tightening. "That woman once served the families of this base better than most agencies combined. She gave my men a place to breathe when they came home with no words, and she treated a decorated Marine with the respect this nation promised him and forgot." Ray cleared his throat. "Speaking for the first time, she didn't ask questions," he said quietly. "She didn't flinch when I walked in with a dog. She just poured the coffee and gave me a place to sit. That was the first time in a long time I felt like a person again." A tear slipped down a woman's cheek near the register. Colonel Gaines nodded, then turned to the Marines waiting outside. He stepped toward the door, and with a simple motion, he raised his hand in signal. They filed an orderly, silent reverent to. Marines moved behind the counter and removed the corporate logo from the wall, folding the vinyl panel like a flag. Another replaced the chalkboard sign with a new one brought from their vehicle. It read in bold, white hand-painted letters, "Welcome to Grace's house where honor is served daily." When Deborah Lyle tried to interject, Colonel Gaines looked at her only once. "You've made your decision," he said. "Now we'll make ours." Then he stepped outside, phone in hand. A moment later, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked down, confused. "It's a direct message from Fort Granger. She said they've requested Grace report to base headquarters today." Ray let out a slow breath. Eyes wide, Shadow stood, and in the cafe that once held coffee and comfort, something entirely new was brewing, a reckoning. Grace sat in her truck on the edge of her driveway, keys in hand but engine off. She'd been sitting there for 15 minutes, still in her cafe clothes, coffee-stained jeans, her favorite blue flannel and shoes that had seen more spilled espresso than she cared to count. Grace stared out at the road, replaying the morning over and over again, fired in front of customers for doing the right thing. And now, a message from the base. Colonel Gaines would like to meet at Fort Granger headquarters today. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it was a good thing, but somehow deep down, she felt the shift. Something larger than her life at the Mason mug had just begun. Grace took a breath, turned the ignition, and headed down the familiar road she'd driven hundreds of times before. Only this time, she wasn't going to drop off muffins or coffee canisters. This time, she was going through the gates. Fort Granger stood like a city of disciplined, orderly roads, flag-lined avenues, the sound of cadence calls echoing in the background. Grace had been there as a military wife before. But now, walking into the main administration building, she felt like an outsider again. Colonel Richard Gaines met her at the door. He wasn't in dress blues now, just a clean khaki uniform and a calm presence that could command a room. With a glance, "Grace," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it firm but unsure, still not entirely sure why I'm here. "Let me show you something." He led her down a hallway lined with portraits of past commanders, training maps, and commendation plaques. They stopped in front of a door labeled Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, the room was filled with folding chairs, whiteboards, and boxes of unused supplies. A few young staffers moved quietly in the corner, setting up therapy mats and moving donated equipment. "This is a pilot program," he explained. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for 2 years. Trouble is, it's hard to find someone who understands vets, not just from paperwork, but from the inside." Grace folded her arms. "I'm not a therapist. I don't have a degree in social work." "No," he said. "But you built a place where men and women with invisible wounds came to heal. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs do with a $1 million budget." She didn't answer right away. Colonel Gaines stepped closer, his tone softening. "You created a sanctuary without realizing it. What you did in that cafe, that was leadership, that was service." Then, from the back room, a voice called out, "Is that her?" A young woman stepped out, mid-20s, long sleeves covering burn scars along her arms and jaw. Her name tag read, Tiffany Rios. She walked slowly, a golden retriever puppy beside her, wearing a red vest marked in training. "Hi," she said shilly. "I just wanted to say I saw the video of you and the dog, and the guy. I haven't been to a coffee shop since I came home, but I think I could sit in a place you run." Grace blinked, the air in her chest shifted. Colonel Gaines smiled. We'd like to offer you a position not as a figurehead, not as a name on a brochure, but as the director of this center. Grace exhaled. You're serious as a heart attack, he said. You'd run the programs, build the space, shape the culture. You already know what works. Community, routine, respect. She looked at Tiffany, now kneeling with her dog. She thought of Ray of Shadow, of the dozens of men and women who'd found their way into the Mason mug, not for lattes, but for peace. And suddenly she knew. I'll do it, she said quietly. The colonel nodded once. Then let's get to work. That night, Grace stood alone in what would soon be the new heart of Fort Grossier's outreach efforts. The walls were bare, the floors still scuffed, but the air felt full of something sacred. She reached into her bag and took out an old photo. Michael, her husband, sitting outside the cafe, his boots up, smiling at her. She pinned it to the wall. No plaque, no frame, just memory and mission. Words spread faster than she imagined. By the end of the week, the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center at Fort Granger wasn't just another military initiative. It had become something alive. Veterans who hadn't stepped foot on base in years showed up. Young soldiers returned with hesitant spouses. Even the local newspaper, the Mason Herald, ran a full-page spread from Café to Command, how Grace Donnelly is rebuilding trust one cup at a time. Grace didn't do anything flashy. She didn't bring in fancy speakers or consultants. She just did what she'd always done. She paid attention. She asked names and remembered them. She posted a whiteboard near the coffee pot that read, "Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener?" She let dogs curl up in corners of therapy rooms without a fuss. She kept that same handwritten notebook from the cafe and added new pages, one for every vet who walked through the door. Some days were quiet, some were hard, some were full of nothing but silence and refills. But something powerful was building, a space where pain wasn't hidden and healing didn't need to be loud. Ray came often now. Shadow would walk straight to his favorite corner and lie down like he'd always belonged. Tiffany Rio showed up every Tuesday. She wasn't ready to speak in groups yet, but she'd begun sketching again. Images of dogs' hands and homecomings and Lena. The young barista from the Mason mug visited every Friday. She brought coffee. Yes, but also laughter. And when Grace needed a second opinion on anything from wallpaper to website wording, Lena was the first to weigh in, but not everyone was thrilled. Some officials questioned why someone with no formal training was running a federal pilot program. Auditors arrived quietly, clipboards in hand, suits stiff with skepticism. They examined logs, asked probing questions, even tested the water filters on the coffee machine. At the end of their review, one inspector looked Grace dead in the eye and asked, "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans?" Grace didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly. "Just consistency and kindness." The inspector didn't respond, but he took notes. A week later, Grace received a formal notice. The Wellness Center was being reviewed for possible national model expansion. Colonel Gaines called it a victory. Grace just called it humbling. But even as the center grew, the Mason mug still tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she returned quietly without announcement. Lena was behind the counter. "You're supposed to be famous now," she teased, sliding a mug across the counter. "I'm just here for coffee," Grace said, smiling. The cafe had changed. Photos of vets now lined the walls. Ray, Tiffany, and others. A new sign had been hung near the register, Grace's corner, where no one sits alone. Later that day, Grace drove across town to speak at a local fundraiser for veteran families. It was a modest event, mostly older folks and kids with crayon posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog." The crowd fell silent. Then applause, loud, long reel, and somewhere in the back, Rai stood, his silver star pinned to his chest, and gave her a quiet salute. Back at the center that night, Grace sat alone by the wall of photos. She added one more. A picture of the cafe taken the day after the Humvees came. People standing shoulder-tosh, shoulder dogs lying under tables, coffee in every hand. No fear, no shame, just connection above it. She taped a small card that read, "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves, it's what we protect in others." And in that stillness, Grace understood the cafe hadn't closed. It had simply moved. 3 weeks after the fundraiser, a letter arrived. It came in a sealed envelope stamped with the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. Colonel Gaines handed it to Grace personally. They stood inside her office at the Wellness Center, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space still learning how to heal. He didn't say much, just, "You'll want to sit for this." She opened it slowly. The official language blurred as her eyes scanned the first line. You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans. She read it again. Then again. I didn't do anything special, she whispered. Colonel Gaines chuckled. That's exactly why you're getting it. The letter came with an invitation, not just to attend a ceremony in Washington, but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Grace felt her knees go weak. I'm not a public speaker. You are now. The day she left for D.C. She packed light, just one blazer, an old watch of Michael's, and the same notebook she'd used behind the cafe counter for years. Names, birthdays, notes like Tiffany prefers tea and don't ask Rye about May 15th. That notebook had carried more weight than any resume as she waited at the airport. She heard someone call her name, "Need a ride, Miss Donnelly." She turned to see Ray McMillan standing tall in full dress blues shadow, calmed by his side tail gently wagging. The base assigned me as your escort, he said with a grin. Grace laughed, half nerves, half awe. You clean up pretty good, he smirked. You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon. The ballroom at the conference was larger than she expected, white tablecloths, polished brass podium cameras at every angle. Her name glowed on the screen behind her in elegant lettering. When she stepped up to the microphone, her voice was smaller than the room, but the room leaned in. I'm not a general. I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I managed a cafe near a military base. I served coffee. I listened to pause. But in that space, I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen. People nodded, a few wiped away tears one day. I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee. It was about dignity. Applause thundered through the hall. Ray stood in the back. He didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He just nodded like a soldier hearing his orders finally clearly. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the PTOAC, Grace stepped out outside alone. She needed airspace. Silence. A man in a gray suit with a white beard approached, quiet, kind eyes behind thin glasses. You don't remember me, do you? He asked. She studied his face. It stirred something. He pulled out an old photograph. Grainy, faded, her Michael and the older man in uniform outside the cafe, long before her husband's last deployment. You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge. You didn't say anything, you just smiled. It was the first time I felt like myself again. He held out the photo. It's yours now. She took it with trembling fingers. Words caught in her throat. Back home in Mason, the town held a welcome celebration, but Grace didn't go straight there. She returned to the wellness center. It was late, quiet. A few veterans still lingered near the fire pit. She walked to the wall of photos, reached into her bag, and added one more. A snapshot of the conference crowd, giving her a standing ovation beside it. She taped the old cafe photo, the one with Michael and the soldier from long ago. And below them, she wrote a simple line, "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. Is this the place for people like us? Grace smiled gently. No, son. This is the place for people like all of us. And just like that, her circle wasn't just full. It was open in a world that moves faster every day. It's easy to overlook the quiet moments, the soft-spoken waitress, the trembling veteran, the wag of a service dog's tail. But sometimes those moments are the ones that shape us, Grace. Donnelly didn't wear a uniform, she didn't hold rank, but she upheld something sacred, dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that honor isn't earned once it's defended daily. What happened at that small cafe in Mason, Georgia, may seem like a rare story, but maybe it shouldn't be. How many Graces have we walked past without noticing? How many veterans have we thanked only with words, not actions, in today's divided world? Grace's story asks us to pause, to ask ourselves, would I have stood up like she did have? I ever kept quiet when I should have spoken up? We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of courage in your own life? Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of someone else's grace. Share your story. In the comments below, your experience could inspire someone else to do the right thing even when it's hard. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in quiet heroes at this channel. We tell stories that matter, stories that honor not just the uniform, but the humanity behind it. Because sometimes the strongest stand doesn't come with a salute.